This podcast is about the West, and it has featured a variety of individuals who write about the region. But one thing we haven't talked about much over the past 77 episodes is audience. Who are all these people writing for? And does intended audience change how or what they write? Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. Today we speak with Dr. Adam Sowards about the different stages in his writing career and how he began as a traditional academic historian but has pivoted in the last decade to write more explicitly to non-academic audiences across a range of venues and formats. His output has been impressively diverse and offers some important insights that other writers wanting to connect with new audiences should consider, especially those wanting to engage with local and regional Western public audiences. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, here's a brief introduction to the podcast and myself. Writing Westward is a monthly podcast featuring conversations with historians, journalists, scientists, and scholars from various disciplines who are writing about the North American West. The goal of these exchanges is to spark your curiosity to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the peoples who have called it home. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and I'm a Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation. I am the host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and I'll take any excuse to read more and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. If you have a moment, please subscribe and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Share links with friends and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X, Twitter, and send in some feedback. At the end of the episode, I will include some more information about my own scholarship and the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. And with that, let me introduce who we are talking to this month and why. Dr. Adam Sowards is an environmental historian and writer, specializing in public lands and conservation in the U.S. West, and especially the Pacific Northwest. His academic and ongoing public writings can be accessed at his website, adamsowards.net. Dr. Sowards earned his PhD in history from Arizona State University. He was a professor of history at the University of Idaho from 2003 to 2022. But is now retired with emeritus status and working as a freelance writer. During his years as an academic historian, he was active and prolific, penning multiple articles and a number of very well-received books. Most recently, he published in 2022 with Rowman and Littlefield, Making America's Public Lands, The Contested History of Conservation on Federal Lands. And in 2020, with the University of Oklahoma Press, An Open Pit Visible from the Moon, the Wilderness Act, and the Fight to Protect Miners Ridge and the Public Interest. Our conversation today focuses on the turn he has made over the past decade or so towards writing for non-academic audiences. Academic writers have something important to gain by surveying his public work. From the Reckoning with History series he published in High Country News, to creative nonfiction pieces in various magazines and journals, to occasional pieces for local newspapers in Northwest Washington, to the weekly Taking Bearings essays, where he follows his curiosity, writing about the intersections between history, nature, and people. Over this past decade, he has applied his skills as an academically trained historian to research local and broader Western stories about the environment and the peoples in it, and relates them in accessible ways. Aimed at the general public, these pieces ask intriguing questions, narrate engaging stories from our past, link them to the present, and deftly embeds scholarly analysis in ways that do not intimidate or weigh down the text. This is all things that academics should consider. We do have expertise and knowledge that would benefit the public, but we are often unskilled in presenting it to them in effective ways. I especially would point listeners to a piece that Sowards published in the spring-summer 2023 issue of the Pacific Northwest Quarterly entitled Being Historically Faithful in Public. as a succinct and illuminating rumination on the methodology of public writing. It maybe should be required reading for all of us. As a scholar myself with no formal training in writing for the general public, it provided me with a clear set of principles to consider and follow in all of my public engagements. Adam Sowards, welcome to Writing Westward.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to talk about some of your older work and some of your newer work. This is going to be a little bit of a peculiar episode, as we're not focusing on like a single book that you wrote, but kind of this larger project that you seem to have been working on for the last decade or so of writing for public audiences.
Sounds great.
So for the listeners, a little forewarning, this might be a little more freewheeling, kind of all over the place than we're used to. I want to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your personal relationship with the West, kind of your background in the region.
Sure. I grew up north of Seattle in a small, well, it was small when I grew up there, a town named Marysville. And it was about 40 miles north of Seattle. I went to college south of Seattle in Tacoma, went to graduate school in Arizona. I often like to say that I've spent my whole life in the West except for a 2-month exile right after I graduated college and did a little history program in Pennsylvania. Other than that, I've always been in the West. For almost 20 years, I taught at the University of Idaho. So I got to stay in the Pacific Northwest, which is my native region, but on the interior part of that, which is different from the coastal part that I grew up in. I left there in 2022. I finished my position at the University of Idaho and moved back to the west side. I now live in the Skagit Valley, about 20 miles from where I grew up, within a view of the Olympic Mountains and Puget Sound. And I'm back on the saltwater coast, and I feel much at home there. But the West has always been home. It's been what I've wanted to study since I was a college student, and it's not exclusively what I've written about, but pretty close to exclusively what I've written about.
So growing up there in the Pacific Northwest, can you identify the moment or kind of the stage in your life where you started thinking about the West as a region, kind of critically thinking about place and where you lived and if it was somehow unique? Or did that not come until later in grad school?
It did come later, for sure. I grew up in a family where lots of stories were told. My mom's roots were in Texas, but she grew up all around. She lived in lots of different places. And my dad's family came from Iowa before they ended up in the Pacific Northwest. So we were all migrants at some point here. But even though we told lots of stories and paid a lot of attention, I think, to the past in my family, I didn't think about the West really as a place distinct. That might be related to the fact that we didn't travel a ton when I was a kid, so I didn't have a chance to see either more of the West or to see other regions to notice that the West is different. When I was a junior in college, I took a history of the West course at the University of Puget Sound with Drew Eisenberg when he was there, and the lights really turned on there. I really enjoyed that class. It probably was my favorite class up to that point, and knew I wanted to be studying that. I think even at that moment, though, I'm not sure I understood very deeply the West as a place. I went to graduate school in Arizona, and that was a different part of the West for sure. And then some of those maybe subcultures and sub-regions within the West started to make themselves more clear. Like many things in my life, I approached a lot of it intellectually first rather than experientially. I'm not necessarily proud of that, but that's kind of the way it's been for me. I think intellectually thinking about the West, I was in grad school when the new Western history was still fairly new in the 1990s. And there was a lot of ferment and excitement around thinking about these questions. And then at that point, everything moving forward was, I think, deeply focused on the West. Although I would say since I've left academia, thinking about the West has changed even more, and not being tied to the same historiographical questions has made the West a different, somewhat richer place to study, to think about.
So, kind of the academic framing of some of your previous writing, did you feel like it put some boundaries or some kind of restrictions on not just kind of what you think about the West, but how you approach the region as a writer? Like as you've now shifted to kind of to more like, public writing, local history things.
When I was writing academic work primarily, I don't think I felt limited. But once I started writing less for academics, I did notice that there were limitations that were gone. And that could be with the framing question. That could be with how I present it, how I think about it, especially in terms of audience. Because when you're writing for professional historians, or if you're imagining a group of graduate students in a seminar debating your work, that's a very different way that you set up your writing than if you think you're writing to the audience of High Country News, or if you're writing to just interested people who love national parks. And so there's a different way that I have come to imagine the importance of the work that I'm trying to do, and the way, the level of expertise that an audience has, which changes how to present it.
I don't want to scoop ourselves because this is kind of a topic that I think that I wanted to get to later in this conversation. But it's interesting that you yourself noticed it. And I haven't anticipated this is something that you might be saying, that it's changed how you think about the region, not just how you write about it, but how you think about it. And that's really interesting. I think that's something we'll circle back to. Did you think of yourself growing up as a Westerner or as a Pacific Northwesterner? And is that different after you left the region? I mean, Arizona couldn't be much different than Northwest Washington, in terms of environment and whatnot.
Yeah.
How do you sit with that identity, like the Westerner identity?
Yeah, I don't think I grew up thinking of myself as a Westerner or a Pacific Northwesterner in any real clear way at all. And it must have emerged in graduate school in some way, doing all of that, thinking about and reading about and writing about what the West is and where the West is and and you're right, you can't sit in Arizona and think back of home, the Pacific Northwest, and imagine something more stark. And that those 2 months where I was exiled in Pennsylvania right after college actually was very important to understand why the West is a different place. I remember when I was trying to decide whether to participate in that program right after undergraduate, I asked a prospective graduate mentor, like, should I do this? And he said, you should, because you will then appreciate why the West is the best place. And I think that was said a little bit tongue in cheek, but in a whole lot of ways, it was true. And I spent the first part of my time in Pennsylvania kind of miserable. Like, this isn't the West. I don't like the weather. The landscape's weird. There's too many people around. Before I sort of said, okay, just accept this for what it is and appreciate it. And then I ended up enjoyed historic sites that I wouldn't have been able to see in the West and that sort of thing. But I guess if I had to pick a moment, maybe it was my drive from Pennsylvania to Arizona, because I went straight from that program to graduate school, where it really solidified in my mind, the West is different, and that's where I'm from, and that's what I want to study and think about for the rest of my life.
Fascinating. Yeah, sometimes it's not till you return home that you really come to see home more clearly. I felt that way. I think about where I grew up profoundly differently now, having lived away from there, for the last, 30, 25 years. Well, I also want to talk a little bit, before we get to some of your public writing, I want to talk about your academic training, because especially for our listeners who are academics, I want to try to kind of establish how you operated within worlds that they're very familiar with in terms of writing and publishing, and then transition to do some other things which I'm hoping this episode will not necessarily give like a blueprint or a roadmap for people to follow, but maybe inspire some academics to say, oh, well, maybe I could do that too. And so I want to try to establish that maybe you're not as weird as we may think, at least starting out. So you went to University of Puget Sound. Also, I did not know that Drew Eisenberg started his or taught there early in his career. That's wild.
Yep.
And then you went to ASU. In terms of like that academic training, was it pretty standard kind of, master's and PhD work, or was there lots of thinking about public audience or public history in that training?
That's a great question. It was a very strong at that time public history program at Arizona State, and I was not at all involved with it. I'm sure that there were great benefits that I could have obtained had I done that, but I hadn't at that time. I was not thinking along those lines back when I was in my early 20s. And I think the training was pretty standard academic training. However, I had two main advisors, Peter Iverson and Steve Pine. And Peter was a tremendously generous person who had no airs about him and wrote very clearly for anyone who wanted to read. So I'm sure that I imbued some of his ethic about being approachable in my writing. And Steve, of course, I think thinks of himself as a writer first rather than a historian first. And so I'm sure I learned lessons from him about thinking about writing more than thinking about historiographical frameworks, for example. And sometimes graduate school, I think, is wasted on the young. And some of the lessons I probably didn't learn then, but they were taught. And I remembered them later on as I made transitions in my career. I often think back about how I would get a lot more out of graduate school now, knowing all that I know and all the things that I did subsequently.
Yeah, I think about courses like that. Man, I should have taken that, or I should have. There's so many things that I would do differently now, because there's a lot of things that I think maybe we both had to learn along the way that we probably should have just been trained in formally. Well, your early kind of publication work in terms of books does lay out. I mean, all of them kind of lay out in a very kind of familiar pattern. Well, you did a environmental history of the West Coast for a trade press, but then right after that published, I assume, what was your dissertation on American conservation and William O. Douglas. But then things start to shift a little bit in the mid-20 teens with this edited volume you did on Idaho, kind of this collection of essays about Idaho history. It was for its 100th anniversary,
No,
or no, sesquicentennial.
there was no occasion for it.
Oh,
It
all right,
was
just a new.
it was close to its sesquicentennial, but that was not the intent when I put it together.
Talk to us about. I think it was around this time that you were asked to write about the Idaho landscape of 1863, and the audience for that was going to be legislators, like state legislators. And I don't know if you view this as kind of a moment that kind of shifted, or had you start thinking about, oh, there are other audiences that I could be addressing. Tell us about that moment and that project, and kind of how that reoriented your view of your career and what you were doing as a writer.
Yeah, thanks. That was it's an occasional publication that was co-sponsored by the Idaho State Historical Society and the universities in the state. And that was for the sesquicentennial of Idaho becoming a territory. And I was asked to write about the landscape of 1863, the time of territorial, when Idaho became a territory on its own. And I was told that every legislator in the state would get a copy of this publication. And no one had ever told me such a thing before. And I imagined what an interesting opportunity that was to lay out perhaps a more complicated story about Idaho to that audience. And that audience seemed like a worthwhile audience to reach with a complicated story. I imagined that this marking the territorial period would be one of celebration. And I thought, we can do that, but we should also recognize there were some pretty significant costs to what was being celebrated. So it was an opportunity to talk about dispossession rather than just the territorial status. It was a place to talk about a great deal of death and destruction and violence for the native peoples of Idaho, and not just look at the great accomplishments of the new territorial period and people. And I never imagined writing for a political audience, and I have no idea if any of those legislators read anything in that volume. I hope they did. But it was a way to think that the primary audience was not journal subscribers, academic journal subscribers, or people who bought monographs published by a university press. And so that was an important moment for me to widen how I imagined potential audiences. And I remember it was around this time too, just paying attention to the news, right? And historians talk about the news, just that we're not always talking about the past. And I remember talking to people like it's so much more complicated than journalists say are talking about. There is a historical component to this. Why isn't anyone talking about this? And at some point it occurred to me, well, I could. I could be one of the people that says there's a history to this. Why don't we talk about why things looked this way? And so I started to act on that impulse.
I was going to ask how that work with the legislature was received, but are you indicating like just crickets?
From where I sat, there was crickets.
Okay.
Maybe the editors heard something, but I don't remember ever being told that.
But they didn't chase you off University of Idaho campus with pitchforks.
They did not. No.
Okay, well that's good. That's good. Well, I think that many historians feel that the public would benefit from their expertise and knowledge. We struggle to sometimes get their attention or to convince them of that. Like, so thinking about this relationship in reverse and your experience writing for non-academic audiences, do they think that they would benefit in real ways from our scholarship? Or do we have to convince them of that?
Oh, what a good question. It depends. It seems to me that I've been really lucky to work with lots of editors who do not have to be convinced about the importance of history and context and humanistic perspectives on things. On occasion, I have to be persuasive about why a certain topic that interests me has resonance today and relevance today.
Like the why now?
Exactly.
Okay.
For me, often something is interesting just because it existed and we ought to know about it. But for editors, especially editors who are paying, they have to have a justification for why do we need to know about that particular arcane thing from the past in 2025 or whenever it is we're writing. And that can sometimes be a harder sell. But I don't think it's that difficult of a sell to say history matters, because history does matter. And we just have to be pretty explicit about that. And we can see the legacies of things from the past playing out every single day now.
As you've at various times like written for more and more local audiences, like with kind of narrower and narrower local topics, have you found that dynamic shift at the local level? Do you find more interest from that public that, oh my goodness, someone's writing about my rural county in Northwest Washington, and there's some kind of built-in kind of local pride and whatnot. Has that influenced the reception, do you feel?
I don't ever feel super comfortable talking about the reception. I don't know how much what people take from the things that they read. But like, yes, I've written about this county where I live now. I write sometimes for a local, very small town newspaper, telling about the history of that community. And I think there's a great pride in that local level and a curiosity about, oh, I didn't know what had gone on in that building right there that I see every single day. And that local pride, I think, is really important. There's a built-in audience for that. And when you can sneak in, scholarly insights that are not heavy-handed and that are part of this local story rather than some large debate that scholars have been having for 20 years or 50 years or whenever, I think that helps widen the frame for that local audience who might not normally think about their small town and how it connects to a process that is repeated across thousands of miles for hundreds of years.
Yeah, so the so what things that get historians so excited may not automatically get the local public is excited that you're writing about where they live, but we have to be a little covert sometimes and yeah, as you say, sneaking in some of our bigger context or showing why this matters not just to you because you live there, but why this actually should matter to other people, and reorienting local publics to realize that something that to them may seem like, well, why would anyone other than us care about this small, insignificant thing that happened 100 years ago here might actually shed light on bigger issues, which I would hope would kind of increase their pride or make them think, oh, like my little locality is important in bigger scales as well. And that has to be exciting. But like as you say, we can't beat them over the head with historiography and theory and get too deep in the weeds, and we just lose them immediately, I would
I think,
assume.
yeah, I think that's right. And usually you don't have the space for that sort of thing. You know, you're writing for a local newspaper, you get 500 words, 800 words if you're lucky. There's only so much you can do.
It's really hard. I mean, I have students write for this Intermountain Histories project that I run, and I have them. Well, actually, some of your students wrote for it as well.
Mhm.
And consistently, one piece of feedback I've gotten is like, I wish I had more words. Like writing a 300 to 500 word thing and saying anything of significance. At first, the students are like, "Oh, great, it's a short assignment." But then afterwards, they're like, "It would have been easier if it was a longer assignment."
Yeah,
Yeah, more
for
word
sure.
count to play with. A lot of some of the framework for what I want to talk about today comes from this article you wrote in 2023 for the Pacific Northwest Historical Quarterly, called "Being Historically Faithful in Public," where you're kind of ruminating on all of this, on the prospect of writing for public audiences and whatnot. And I always apologize when I quote people to themselves because I hate it when people quote me to myself. But you write that there's this really missed opportunity if we don't try to engage in this, that we're just feeding into the worst stereotypes about, oh, these academics in their ivory tower and they don't care about, the real world. And so trying to engage with non-academic audiences is important. And you write, and here's the quote, you say, "We owe it to that audience to reach out and meet them where they are." And you also suggest that often we don't. I don't want you to name names or books that fail to do so, but kind of in broad terms, can you identify any kind of common missteps that you see academics taking as they try to address a non-academic audience, but fail to kind of meet that audience where it is?
When we're in graduate school, we're taught to fill a gap in the literature, and the literature is vast. And we read dozens and dozens and hundreds of books, and we find a question that might not be answered right, or we might not have been answered in this locality or with this group of people, and we try to make our mark by getting to that small. It doesn't have to be small, but getting to that place that no one's quite looked at before. And so we come to answering those questions with a lot of baggage. And I don't mean that in a bad way. We have all this information and all of this framing because we've read, you know, 15 case studies about settler colonialism in one place or another and how it plays out. And then we want to apply it in this other location. And so, with all of that baggage, I think our vision can be kind of narrowed. And our public audiences don't have that baggage. They don't have that framework in mind. And it's second nature to scholars of the West. They know all of this stuff. They've read the same books. They know that field, what the literatures look like. And so it can be a special language that scholars share, even though it's English. And even though the public knows every word you're saying, it's not like it's a mystery word, but the broader historical and historiographical context becomes mystifying, I think. And so I think that's one of the ways that if we approach it from, hey, I'm filling a gap in the literature, we're probably going to be in trouble in terms of keeping our audience engaged.
If that's like the primary, what we lead with or we feature really prominently, we just lose them immediately. They're like, well, they don't see why that matters.
I think that they can see why that matters, but we sell our books to a university press editorial board by saying, here's the gap in the literature I'm filling. We get tenure and promotion because we've contributed to the field in this particular way. And I think I have a great respect for public audiences, and I think that they can be brought along to understand why that's all really interesting. But if that's the place you start, they can't start there with you because they haven't read those dozens and dozens of books. And so that has to come later in the conversation, is
Yeah.
I think what I'm trying to say about that.
So we need to think more carefully about what it is they're bringing to the table, not just in terms of interest. I mean, that's another discussion. What questions do the public have? What are the gaps in their knowledge or the things that they're curious about that we could fill? But beyond that, what in terms of background knowledge are they bringing to the table that we might just be completely missing the mark if we're approaching it from without that consideration. I know I wrote one, I guess it wasn't an op-ed. I don't know what you would call it. It was for Public Radio International. I wrote a piece a few years ago, and the back and forth with those, journalist editors was eye-opening because these are all the questions that they were hammering me with. They're like, well, this is super fascinating, but where's the hook? Why should the public care? Why should they read beyond the lead or the first paragraph? Because as you have it written now, they're not going to continue on to paragraph 2. And it was one of the most challenging kind of editorial back and forth experiences I'd had because it was a real challenge. But I think that if I had, maybe read this piece that you wrote in the Pacific Northwest Quarterly, it wasn't written at the time, I would have benefited so much. I think there were a lot of missteps at that early stage that I would have avoided, but had to just kind of wade through. And I haven't done that kind of writing again, if that's an indication of how well. I think it went fine, but it was a real challenge. Some of the first things that you wrote kind of in this vein were op-eds for High Country News, Crosscut, the Los Angeles Times. That was maybe a few years later, but it sounds like you didn't have any explicit training in how to write an op-ed. Did you have some trepidation about it, or did you just dive in fully enthusiastic?
I suppose I had trepidation earlier because I didn't do it. So there was probably part of me who thought, I don't remember this being explicit, but I probably thought, boy, I should probably get tenure first before I start spouting off a little bit. And so there was some freedom that came with tenure and then promotion to full for sure. In fact, I think if you look at my CV really closely, you'll see that when I got promoted to full professor, you saw a lot more public writing right after that happened.
If there's an immediate explosion,
Yeah,
that's
it
funny.
doesn't feel like, again, like I don't feel like I was limited, but there probably was something psychologically holding me back until that point. So yeah, no training, no particular training. The trepidation was, I think, only slight because even though it's an op-ed, I use most op-eds that I've written have been based in historical facts and grounding. Like these are things that happened. Here's how that helps shape how I see this thing that's happening today. And so I became a history major back as an undergraduate because I thought history was the best way for me to understand the world I inhabited. And I know that other people choose other disciplines for the same reason, that helps them understand the world that they inhabit. But it strikes me that to understand the moment we live in, sometimes that historical perspective matters. I know that for me, studying history shaped my politics, not the other way around. Students often thought it was the other way around, that I had certain politics, and so I saw that in the history. No, it was studying history that made me develop certain sort of principles and moral judgments about what is right and proper in a society. And so being able to share those perspectives based on something that happened historically that has resonance with something that's happening at this moment is kind of how that came to be. And the very first one I remember writing, I'm not sure it was the first one, it was during the 2016 presidential primary campaign, and one of the candidates said something that was really ignorant about the history of the West. And I did what I assume lots of Western historians did. I grumbled to my friends about how dumb this was that this person said this thing. And then I like, well, why don't I write that and explain to everyone why we shouldn't be listening to this particular point because it's grounded in something that's ignorant.
There's some inherent, I don't know if risk is the right word, but there's some care we need to take, though, as if our starting point for op-eds, these writings are like contemporary issues, like especially fraught issues, like a political campaign, and especially if you are pre-tenure, these things do have to be done carefully, especially as we explicitly link historical or place contemporary events into historical contexts that might, get people all bent out of shape. But I mean, I always tell people if history is not making you at least a little uncomfortable at some point, then we're forcing you to ask some hard questions. Then you're probably not. It's probably not very good history, right? History should always cause a little discomfort and introspection and careful thinking. The public's not, and especially politicians, are not up for that usually.
I would note too that when I started doing that was a decade ago, and things are different now. I think things are riskier now, and I have certain. I had at that when I started doing that, I had certain like employment that was pretty well guaranteed. I'm a man. I'm a white man. I had some freedom to do these sorts of things that other people would take far greater risks at doing than I would.
Let's talk about some of the magazine, not op-eds, but kind of a little bit longer magazine articles you've done. One of the most prominent is the series you did for High Country News for quite a while called Reckoning with History. Is that what it was?
Yeah.
But you've also, you've written for the Smithsonian Magazine, Zocalo Public Square, I think a few times, and some other kind of magazine format things. How did those opportunities arise? If other people have also had this thought, like, wow, there's something going on today that I have historical context that really needs to be inserted into this public discourse about, the election or whatever it is. How have you gone about setting up these publication venues? Were they solicited? Were you approached? Did you approach them and pitch them? How have you kind of gone about this with some of these magazines?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a total mystery to I think most academics. They don't know how these things work, and I have had a whole variety of ways these opportunities have come to me. For example, High Country News, I had written a couple of op-ed things for them, and the editor at the time at some point said, "We'd love to see more stuff from you." And I thought that was nice encouragement, and I didn't do anything on it for a while. Then, like, the idea of the series Reckoning with History came to me, and I thought I should just, ask the editor if he would be interested in having, kind of regular stories that put current events into historical context. And not being shy at that moment, I had the idea and I wrote him almost immediately, and then had conversations about how that would develop. And I did that for a year and a half or 2 years, something like that. Zocalo Public Square was an entirely different experience. An editor reached out to me and said, "Hey, there's this event happening in Idaho, and we think you'd be a great person to write about it." And I thought, I am not at all the person to write about this thing you're talking about.
This was the
But
Trailing the Sheep Festival
exactly.
piece?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly what it was. And I was like, I can't do that, but I could do this other thing maybe. Does that sound interesting? So like my advice to people here is if someone reaches out to you and you can't do exactly the thing they're asking for, see if they're amenable to a different type of project. And then for the Smithsonian piece, they were doing a series on rivers, and I thought this would be a great way for me to get to know the river that I see out my house window, and learn more about it. So that was a cold pitch with an editor I'd never worked with before, and that worked well. So it's I think being audacious and inviting yourself into places and saying, "Hey, would you be interested in this sort of thing?" It's doing a standard pitch, which is not anything that historians are trained to do, but probably something we all should learn how to do. And then it was being able to be flexible when someone came to me with something that was not exactly something I could do, but was close enough that I could imagine something different. And I'm sure there are other ways that I have gone about getting publications as well. I remember now a local chapter of the Sierra Club reached out to me and said, "We're doing a publication on public lands. We know you're working on a book on public lands. Could you do something for us?" And like, sure, absolutely. So there are lots of ways into this, and some of them have come to me, and I've picked it up, and others I've reached out and sought, and some are just serendipity, and you have to be ready to jump in when that opportunity presents itself.
Are there considerations you think people should have about time and what this adds? So say for an academic who's, a professor somewhere, and that's a full-time job, and this kind of writing sometimes gets you no professional credit, towards tenure, promotion, or whatever. But if you're signing on to, well, there's some timing issues in multiple ways. Often there's a current event that happens and you're like, wow, I have something to share in this moment. And so you approach, High Country News or whoever it is. For it to stay relevant, you may have to crank that out and then go through multiple rounds of back and forth revisions with an editor within a day or two. So there's a real timing issue there. A second timing issue is that if you're trying to pitch or do a series or like a regular column in a paper or a newspaper or a magazine, that's a process of building a relationship of trust in some ways with an audience who is going to come to expect to be hearing from you. And I mean, as academics, we're great at overcommitting because this all sounds so exciting and cool. Like, oh, that would be so much fun. And then we say yes to everything. And then we don't have time to consistently show up to some of those things. Maybe I just answered my own question. But, do you have any advice or thoughts on how to balance that? How to not bite off more than we can chew, but also not being too timid and diving into some of these things?
Well, I think you have to recognize what it is you want to do and need to do most. And if the thing that excites you and really drives you is making those big theoretical interventions in the field, then this is probably not something you should be doing, thinking about how to write for the public. That's not what drives you. But if you are constantly frustrated that the general public doesn't understand the historical roots of some of the issues, or you're frustrated because you hear solutions being proposed that were tried 60 years ago and failed miserably, and that people really need to understand that before we get too far down this road, then if that's what's driving you, you should make an effort to get that point of view out. The question about time management is of course really important, and knowing how long these things take is really important. And you don't know that when you get started. If you do a lot of it, it gets faster for sure. And it's building up a different sort of muscle. One of the things that I've liked about doing the shorter form writing that I've done in recent years is I do it and I'm done and I can move on to something else. Whereas you've written books, you know how long that takes. The book I wrote on Douglas was 10 years from the time I began that research and the time it was in print. So those are big time commitments too. And sometimes it's nice to have a break. And you can also be wise, and many of the articles that I wrote for that High Country News series, Reckoning with History, helped inform the book that I wrote on public lands. And so it's not exactly killing two birds with one stone, but it's getting you to think about something that you can use in multiple venues. And I think that that's a smart, efficient use of your time.
Yeah, so maybe focus on making contributions that are serving your other projects as well, that maybe that the general public wouldn't be interested in. But yeah, killing two birds with one stone in a way. One of the entry points for a lot of these types of pieces, as we already mentioned, is like a current event or something that happens. And hey, we have a historical perspective or context to share that's important. You've also done some writing of kind of what we might call like more kind of like creative nonfiction style more essays as opposed to articles. I don't know if there's a difference in what we call these things, but some of those that you've written for some different magazines, I noticed that the starting point for those pieces is not like current event, Ryan Zinke, Department of Interior, blah, 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 blah. But often your entry point is you and a real life experience that you had. And you use that as kind of the opening hook to get the public to, oh, there's an interesting human story here. This author's telling me something about themselves. Was that an intentional rhetorical device to use as an entry point, or just something that came organically? Because in all of those style pieces, I think that's how you kind of frame all of them, is you and your experience, out on the land or whatever it is.
Yeah. So that work that I do, those essays, that creative nonfiction, serves a different purpose for me than this other writing. And I don't usually approach that as here's a historical lesson that I want to make sure people get. But because I'm a historian, my experiences on the land, out on the landscape, inevitably lead to history. So
Those are like the glasses that you wear. Like
exactly.
Those are the lenses through which you're viewing the world. So
Right.
I'm not here intending to teach you about history, but this is just how I think about the world.
Exactly. And there's a story that I often tell, and it's about one of the essays that you're hinting at. And I went to a river not far from my home, and I just went with a notebook one day and started writing. And the next thing I knew, I was musing about this place and what it had been in previous generations. And then I went and did research about it to find out how correct I was and to deepen my understanding of this place. It's a place that Lewis and Clark came through. It's a place where a town got submerged behind a dam as the reservoir waters rose, and village sites from, thousands of years before disappeared. And I shared this essay as I was drafting it with a writing group, and it's all about how I'm seeing these ghost landscapes that no longer exist, but I know that they were there because I'm a historian and now know it was there. And my writing group said, like, is this really how you see the world? And I was incredulous, and I said, is this not how you see the world? And they're like, no. And that's when I started to realize that, well, gosh, not everyone is a historian. And when they go out on the Western landscape, they don't necessarily see the past that I see because they don't know that. And so that can be part of the voice that I bring to those more personal pieces, is because I know those things or can learn those things, I can bring it out that way. But often you raise an interesting question because it does start with me, but sometimes it's me just having an experience, and that experience inevitably leads to the history because that's how I move through the world.
I mean, I often tell people that being trained as a historian is not. I mean, it is about learning lots of content and whatnot, but I often say it's about a methodological training of learning what kinds of questions to ask. So if someone plops 100-year-old journal entry in front of me, like I have, and I read through it, there are lots of questions that I ask about it that I don't think if my wife was to sit down and read it, she wouldn't be asking those questions. And so you're suggesting something similar here, that when you are out on the landscape traveling about, that you're just viewing the world differently. But hopefully that might inspire the public as they're then out on the landscape to also pause and ask questions they wouldn't have thought to ask.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really powerful tactic that you've used, because in a way you're inviting the public, like holding them by the hand and inviting them to come along with you, say, well, look, you can view the world around you in new ways as well. And I'm going to model that for you and kind of actually walk you through it. It's a kind of writing that I find very intriguing, but really terrifying. I like the idea of trying to write poetically and with profound, thoughts and turns of phrase, but easier said than done.
You asked earlier about the op-ed writing I did and whether I had any trepidation going into that. I would say my trepidation for this kind of writing was much greater.
You've also in 2024, you wrote for like a newspaper articles for the Salish Current and the Laconar Weekly News, which if people want to imagine kind of like a small town newspaper, imagine smaller. I mean, most people in Washington don't know where Laconar is. It's a small little
Yeah.
kind of seaside. I remember my mom and my grandma dragging me around to antique shops, and just as a kid, and I was like, "Oh no, Laconar, no, not Laconar." I just remember dreading walking around these little shops and stuff with them. But so here you have a very specific geographic audience, Skagit County, say. How did you approach those kinds of topics? Were you just kind of looking around the local scene for current events that you have historical insight on? Or did you have historical things first and then you were watching for moments where they might touch something happening? Or were those newspapers asking you, say, hey, we want you to write about X, Y, and Z? Because I think this idea of professional historians writing for not just a newspaper, but a real local newspaper with a very specific local audience is a really interesting prospect.
Yeah. So I retired from the university, and I'm much younger than most people who retire. So I needed to spend my days doing something. And so one of the ways I have spent those days the last few years is I have worked as a freelance reporter for a variety of organizations, nonprofit newsrooms primarily. And you've mentioned a couple of them. And so I have done regular standard reporting on current events, but I've often gravitated toward things in the community have happened that have some sort of resonance with the past. And for example, not far from me is a former state mental hospital. And every summer for the past 4 years, I believe, the local historical society has had a public history day at this. It's been closed for 50 years, this state mental hospital. And it's a really fascinating event. So I can come to that and I can report on what happened on that day, but inevitably that is explaining what happened at that place so many decades ago. And I found, I mean, obviously writing journalism and doing reporting is a different thing than writing a scholarly monograph, but there's a whole lot that is in common. You have to have verifiable facts. You need to have multiple perspectives on anything. So these sorts of things that we're trained to do as historians come in handy when you're trying to explain what's going on today. And then I'm an environmental historian primarily, so there's no shortage of environmental questions in Northwest Washington where I live, whether it's relicensing dams on the Skagit River or whether it's fire policy, and what that means for firefighters in an agency that's either governed by the state or the federal government. This is all sorts of, I can bring some content knowledge to those things, but also just those skills at knowing that there's going to be multiple reasons that cause whatever is the issue is that we're looking at, because I know as a historian that it's never monocausal, right? So it's really good training. Being a historian is really good training to go out and do local reporting. And
And nuanced, like
I
real
think,
quality reporting. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I know you said that you don't think much about reception because, I mean, you might not hear how these things are received. But I do like to imagine, some old grandparent in Skagit County picking up their newspaper and being blown away by this like locally relevant, really nuanced take. But I always do wonder how much appetite the public has for us saying, well, actually, it's more complicated than that. My kids
yeah,
tease me a lot about making everything more complicated, but that is because everything's more complicated.
right,
But maybe that comes in the practice of doing this over and over again, as you find the subtle ways to do that with still with clear writing that the public can grab onto.
right,
You've also done I mean, if the local newspaper is a pretty narrowly defined audience, you've maybe gone even narrower you did a series of posts for a blog for this organization, the Skagitonians? Is that what you call people from Skagit County?
Yeah,
Skagitonians?
Skagitonians.
Skagitonians to preserve farmlands. So here's a local group with a cause.
Hmm.
Was doing that kind of work inherently different than, saying, writing for the papers or writing your broader things for high country news? Or in the end, is it kind of the same process?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And I still write for Skagitonians to preserve farmland. Working on a piece today, in fact, to try to wrap up for them. It's different in the sense that there is a perspective that the organization has that has to be conveyed through the stories that I write for them. So I guess if we were academics, we would say there's a little less academic freedom there, because there is this, it needs to be aligned with their mission. It's a mission that I don't have much trouble aligning myself with, so that's not too difficult of an ask on their part. But I get to tell stories. I get to talk to local people. I get to talk to farmers and what they're doing and learn about why they do the things they do. And all of that, most of that is the same sort of skills as a historian that I would have. Listen carefully, be able to tell the story in a clear way, explain something. I mean, I taught college students for 25 years, and teaching is about explaining. So lots of this public writing, it feels to me just an extension of me as a teacher. Like, there's something going on here, everybody. Let's try to understand what it means. And the nature of my examples and the nature of my sources for writing for this local nonprofit is going to be different than when I'm teaching in a classroom, a college classroom, or writing for a scholarly journal. But the basics of getting source material, explaining something complicated as clearly as possible is pretty similar. And then for Skagitonians, I just have to make sure that the way that story is being told emphasizes their mission.
So does emphasizing their mission, has that rubbed up against kind of your historical methodologies? And there's no such thing as purely objective history. We all know we can toss that pipe dream out the window, but we do have methodologies which try to keep us objective. And we say we don't start with the thesis and then go find evidence to support it. We start with the evidence and see where it leads us. But with this kind of writing, you are starting with a point you're trying to make, right? This
Yeah.
nonprofit has a mission. So how do you balance that while still adhering to, to your professional standards as a historian?
Well,
Very carefully. Maybe that's the short answer.
well, I'm not their historian. I'm their freelance writer that they have hired me, that I have a contract with. They pay me to write stories. And so my relationship to them and to what I'm writing is not fundamentally as historian. So I think that's like, I think we started this conversation way back at the beginning thinking about audience. So the audience here is a different audience than a historical audience, than even a general public audience is. And so I have a different relationship to the material. I've never been asked, and nor would I, make up a fact or say something that's not true. I couldn't do that. That's ethically not right. The organization would never ask me to do that. But I think the main difference is I might write, if someone came to me and said, write a story about this element of agriculture in Skagit County, I would probably come at that. If I was on my own, I would figure my own way into that story. And working for an organization, they tell me the route into that story. They don't tell me what to say or what the quote needs to say from my sources, but they say, we need to emphasize these three things about this time. And that just means I ask people about those three things. And maybe if I were starting it on my own, I would ask three different things.
So it's a matter of just a slightly different process, even though the methodological tools you may use in the end are all the same. But I think some historians would feel a little like, oh, is this unethical? Because it's just a different entry point into a topic. But I find this heartening that maybe we can tone down our anxiety and take a step back and realize there are still careful, disciplinarily ethical ways to engage in, writing for a specific organization or cause, that we can still bring some historical expertise to it, even if they've dictated the entry point or some contours of a narrative. That's okay.
Yeah.
You can still, yeah.
There can be moments where it might feel strange
Mhm.
because, well, I'll pause for just a second. And I suspect that maybe some other scholars have some experience with this. I think most historians, their work is not dependent on grants, for example. But I think a lot of scientists, their work is dependent on grants. And so the work that they do, in part, is guided by what opportunities there is for them to apply for money. And if they had a pot of money and they could do whatever they want, they might do Project X, but because the federal government says, really, Project Y is what we're interested in, you say, well, I'm going to do Project Y now. And that doesn't mean they're making up information for Project Y and they wouldn't have for Project X. It's just it's guided in a different way.
That's an excellent example that I think a lot of, say, academic historians, like, they know the scientists on their campus. They know how that world works. That's a really good way of framing this. Um,
Historians have
yeah,
so much freedom to choose what they want to do. And that's pretty unusual in the world. And
yeah.
so now that I'm not employed as a historian anymore, I've had to learn that, gosh, there are constraints that guide how people make their way through the world, much more than I used to know.
Well, we're quickly running out of time. We haven't really mentioned your taking bearings. What do we call it? A newsletter? What do we call this? A
Well,
series of articles,
these
uh,
days people call them newsletters, but I call it my weekly essay.
weekly essays. So you've been publishing, and this is on wide-ranging topics. Again, the West and the environment, the most prominent among them. But there's a real shocking diversity of the topics that you write these kind of short, self-contained pieces on. Do you have any kind of final thoughts, like thinking about that as something that you're still continually, weekly working on, that other writers should consider if they're thinking about starting to put something out there? How in your approach and your experience in that, what's been successful? What's not gone well? What should we be thinking about?
I think I would encourage people to be open and adaptive, but to know what it is they want to do if they were to choose something like this. I started this just over 3 years ago now and haven't missed a week yet. Knock on wood. Hope that's not this week. And they're about 1,000 words apiece, so that's a whole lot of words that I've written over the course of those three years. And I'm a curious person. I think that's one of the reasons I became a historian, and so this has allowed me to find my curiosity, follow it wherever it is. Maybe I need to know about a piece of legislation I don't know well enough, and I'll go do research and sort of teach a history lesson about the Federal Power Act in 1920 or something like that. And then the next week, I might have gone on a hike or a birding adventure, and I might write about that because that was an interesting way to be immersed in a landscape or a seascape, as it were, and learn from that experience. It is something that shapes my week every week. I have a deadline. I have to meet that deadline. I've never missed that deadline. And so that's, I think, an enormously good practice for any writer, whether they're an academic writer or otherwise, to make sure that you get the words down. And so I've gotten a little faster at it, I think, over these 3 years. There's also a little panic. Every week I have to go, what am I writing this week? I have to come up with a new topic every week. And that also is a really good practice. If you're going to be a journalist, you have to come up with new articles, ideas. If you're a professor, you have to make sure you know what your next lecture is going to be. Coming up with new topics that are digestible in short, you're able to do the research for it and then convey something hopefully in a nice way that people want to read and think about is It's a lot of fun. It's been a lot of work, but I don't view it as onerous too often. And instead, I view it as an opportunity to continue to teach, even though I'm not in a classroom, and continue to learn. And as I turn into new projects, I get to use this as a first place to test out ideas and to go explore new information.
Well, it seems like it's a muscle all of us should be flexing a little bit more. This practice of constantly looking out at the world around us and thinking, what could I write about today on this? Like, because again, like thinking about how you view the world around you as a historian, you wear a different set of lenses. This is another set of lenses, not necessarily just historical, but what is going on around me? What questions could I be asking? And forcing yourself to do that weekly, probably over the course of years, is going to fundamentally change just how you view the world around you, overall. Makes you a more curious person. I think even for those who are still in the classroom, that's going to make you a better teacher, I think, and going to benefit your students. For scholars, it's going to benefit, the bigger books and articles they write. I think it's a muscle that all of us should probably exercise a bit more. So looking down the road, and as we wrap up, what are the new things that you're working on?
Well, I'll keep working on the newsletter for sure, the weekly essay. I don't know how long that will go on, but I have no plans to stop it at this point. I do have a contract to do a synthesis of national parks. So I'm deep in the work of that, and it'll be in the same series that my last book on public lands, which was really big. National parks is just part of those public lands, so I get to narrow in this time, and I'm excited about that. And doing the research for that will include some field visits, of course, and so being able to visit national parks and be immersed in those landscapes and imagine their history and understand how the public that's visiting them is experiencing them, and how they hopefully would have a deeper experience of those places if they understood the longer history, which is a complicated history, not always a nice history for everyone that's been involved, or for not all the creatures that are involved that may not even be in these parks anymore. So that's part of my goal, is to deepen that understanding, to complicate our understanding of these parks as places that are good to learn with, right? So that's the big project that's on my head. Those essays that I periodically write will emerge when, I don't want to say when the mood strikes, but when the moment is right, where there's an experience that I've had, or something that can't stop thinking about, or a place that affected me in a particular way, and I need to figure out what's going on there. Because that kind of writing is fun, difficult, challenging, because it's all about making sense of my own experience in the world. Part of that is going to be historical, but it's not just historical. And not all scholars are going to want to do that. But I think it's really a worthwhile way to exercise new muscles in our minds and in our writing.
I think it all sounds great. I'm excited for the National Parks book, to put it on the shelf beside your public lands one. Well, I just wanted to say, when I heard that you were retiring, I was like, well, you're not old enough. What is going on? You're not old enough to retire. What are you going to do with yourself? It's been exciting to kind of see like all of this new stuff that you've been able to do. And it's I think it is a blueprint that people who, are not going to retire immediately, but want to do some other kinds of writing should really think about. And again, this piece that you wrote for the Pacific Northwest Quarterly, which is available on your website, and I'll link to it, I think is a really profound discussion that any historian thinking about doing non-academic writing for public audiences should really read and think through. There was a lot of I took a lot of notes on it that I'm going to be deploying in class and as I'm doing some of my own writing and stuff. So I really appreciate all this work that you've done.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Brendan.
And I might be sending you some topics that I want you to write, because I grew up in the county right north of you, as you know, and there's all kinds of historical topics that I want to have written about up there, and I don't have time to write them. So I'll start putting ideas in your ear.
That'd be great. I always appreciate suggestions.
All right, Adam. Well, I hope that we can cross paths sometime soon. Maybe next time I'm up your way, or maybe at a conference sometime. But I look forward to seeing you in person again.
Likewise, Brendan. Thanks for this conversation.
All right, take care.
You too.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X Twitter. On those platforms, you can get updates, leave comments, and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream on our YouTube and Facebook pages, have an annual funding cycle with awards, grants, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at Redd Center, that's REDD Center.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is also linked in the show notes. As the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, you can direct any praise or critique my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. My recent books include a 2018 volume, Native Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America, a 2019 anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I also recently launched and will be editing a new series for the University of New Mexico Press entitled The West in Context. Send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also the general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written microhistories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink.org, email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on Blue Sky or X Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, be kind. Cheers.